What if the biggest surprise attack in American history wasn't a surprise at all? On December 7th, 1941, Japan strikes Pearl Harbor. The U.S. wakes up in flames, battleships sinking, planes burning, thousands dead. Then overnight, America unites and charges into World War II. But there's a theory that refuses to die. A theory that says President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew Pearl Harbor was coming and let it happen because he needed one thing the American public wouldn't give him: a reason to go to war. Welcome back to Project Midnight. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadows of history, where intelligence failures might be something darker and where one question hangs in the smoke. Did FDR allow Pearl Harbor as the back door into World War II? Let's start with the uncomfortable part. By 1940 and 1941, the world is on fire. Hitler is swallowing Europe. Britain is hanging on by its fingernails, and Roosevelt, depending on who you ask, either sees the coming storm clearly or is quietly maneuvering the U.S. toward intervention. The problem? America doesn't want another European war. Isolationism is strong. Politicians know it, voters know it, and Roosevelt knows it. So if you believe the backdoor to war theory, here's the alleged logic. Roosevelt can't openly push the country into World War II, but he can create a situation where the enemy makes the first move. And once blood is spilled, public opinion changes in a single night. Now look at what's happening with Japan. Japan is expanding across Asia. The U.S. responds with escalating economic pressure, trade restrictions, strategic embargoes, and eventually the big one, oil. If you cut off Japan's oil, you're not just making a diplomatic statement, you're choking the engine of their military machine. And here's where believers in the theory lean in. If Roosevelt understood Japan's position, then pushing sanctions hard enough might make war inevitable. Not possible, not likely, inevitable. The theory says Roosevelt didn't need to guess if Japan would strike. He just needed to tighten the vise until Japan had to strike. And once Japan strikes, America gets its unity. Roosevelt gets his war. Now we get to one of the most cited pieces of evidence believers point to, the McCollum memo. In 1940, Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum, an intelligence officer connected to naval intelligence, writes a memo proposing actions that could push Japan toward an overt act of war. In the conspiracy version of the story, this memo is treated like a blueprint, a set of moves designed to corner Japan and make them fire first, so the U.S. can respond with clean hands. Now, to be fair, critics argue this memo doesn't prove a plot to sacrifice Pearl Harbor. But from the believer's perspective, it's not about proving every detail. It's about showing intent. The memo represents something chilling. The idea that provoking an attack wasn't just possible, it was openly discussed as strategic advantage. And if you're already suspicious, that's not a comforting fact. Here's where it gets really eerie. The U.S. had cracked Japan's top diplomatic code. This intelligence stream is often referred to as magic, meaning American intelligence was reading Japanese diplomatic communications. And in the days leading up to Pearl Harbor, messages are coming in that suggest the relationship is collapsing fast. The most famous, the 14-part message indicating negotiations were ending. Believers take this and ask, if Washington was reading Japan's communications, how could the attack be a surprise? And then the suspicion sharpens. Maybe it wasn't a surprise. Maybe it was managed. Now, mainstream historians respond, diplomatic codes aren't the same as naval operational plans. Knowing war is imminent isn't the same as knowing the exact target. But the conspiracy logic pushes back. If you knew war was coming any day, and you knew Japan needed a dramatic first strike, why wouldn't Pearl Harbor be on the table? Next, the infamous war warning messages. Washington did send alerts to commanders that war with Japan could happen at any moment. But here's the part believers can't let go. Those warnings, according to the conspiracy narrative, weren't specific enough to prevent disaster in Hawaii. So the theory asks, was it incompetence or was it careful ambiguity? Because vague warnings create plausible deniability. You can always say, we warned them, we didn't know where. We did what we could. But if you wanted the attack to happen just enough to shock the country, just enough to unify America, you wouldn't stop it completely. You'd let it land. Believers often point to readiness issues and strange decisions as circumstantial smoke. Why were planes grouped wingtip to wingtip? Why did radar sightings get dismissed? Why was the threat assessment tilted towards sabotage instead of air attack? Again, critics say, that's bureaucracy, that's misjudgment, that's a military stuck in old thinking. But the conspiracy interpretation flips it. Old thinking doesn't explain everything. Old thinking doesn't explain this level of catastrophic surprise when warning signs were everywhere. The believer's question becomes, how many mistakes does it take before it stops being mistakes? Now, if you're skeptical, this is where you might say, no way, Roosevelt wouldn't gamble thousands of American lives, and that's the strongest emotional rebuttal. But believers counter with a grim historical reality. Governments have sacrificed lives for strategic goals before. Not always with malice, sometimes with cold calculation. And if Roosevelt believed the world was sliding into a nightmare and that America had to intervene to stop it, then Pearl Harbor becomes the brutal doorway into what he thought was the only path forward. A terrible price, but a price he might have believed was worth paying. Here's what we can say with confidence. Roosevelt expected war with Japan was increasingly likely. The U.S. applied intense pressure that made conflict harder to avoid. U.S. intelligence had fragments, warnings, and alarming intercepts. The disaster at Pearl Harbor involved real failures, communication breakdowns, misinterpretations, and readiness problems. But the theory asks a darker question. Were those failures accidental? Or were they convenient? And here's the part that keeps this conspiracy alive, even after decades. There's no single movie moment document that says, let it happen. But history doesn't always leave perfect fingerprints. Sometimes it leaves patterns. And Pearl Harbor, depending on how you connect the dots, can look less like a surprise and more like a permission slip. So I'll leave you with the same question we started with. What if Pearl Harbor wasn't the start of America's war, but the price of admission? If you like this video, hit like, share it with someone who loves hidden history, and subscribe to Project Midnight, because the official story is only the beginning.